Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Anime Reaper and this video is about What If Naruto Found Uzumaki Library Part 1 written by S. Targon. If you like this What If, please show your support and leave a like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to share with your friends and check out the description down below. Without further ado, let's start the What If. Chapter 1, The Power of Observation. Disclaimer, I own nothing, Mori's the pity. Teammate. Chapter 1. It had been a long night and Kurane was exhausted. She'd gotten an early start that morning, so she could scout out the potential new genins at the academy. An unusual number of talented students were taking the test this year, probably enough for 3 full teams. That was why the Sandaime asked her to take on a genin team. She'd worked independently for almost 10 years, ever since that incident. She wasn't happy about being forced to work in a team again, but when the Hokage asks, he doesn't necessarily have to say please. The fact that Sarutobi did so made him even harder to refuse. The old man was actually very considerate of her feelings. He knew that this would be opening old wounds, ever since that tragedy. She ground her teeth to avoid the memory, but only a truly skilled shinobi would note any change of expression. Likewise, no one at the academy could have detected her presence as she observed the students go through their routines. After the Sandaime's request, she decided to utilize the remaining days to observe the students. This was unusual, as most sensei jonins simply waited for the team assignments to be made, trusting the academy instructors to construct well-balanced teams. Kurane was not most jonins. Sarutobi had asked her to revive an old tactical concept, and lead a team of reconnaissance specialists. The last one had come to grief, but she didn't think the concept itself was flawed. What happened to Namaru, Matai, and Kobaru-sensei had been a tragic accident. At least that was what she told herself on her good days. On her bad days, her thoughts were much darker. Sometimes they flirted with treason. Of a sort, anyway. If her suspicions were correct, she wasn't alone in such thoughts, just in failing to act on them. However, she'd been having good days recently, so she occupied herself by watching the potential genins, unheard and unseen. The Inuzuka kid almost sensed her presence during recess when the wind unexpectedly shifted, but she'd been able to move before he could smell her. Mostly she watched them talk and play. She noticed an unusual number of children from prominent shinobi families. Just like their parents, a Nara, a Yamanaka, and an Akimichi were all set to graduate together. If they all passed, there was little doubt they'd be placed on a team together. People liked to stick with what worked. It was just too bad for the boys that the Yamanaka girl looked to be an incredible shrew. She saw a few prospects for a recon team. There was an Abarame kid who was so quiet the instructors tended to lose track of him. If he was any good with his bugs, he'd be a resource for any team. She'd worked on occasion with a man who was probably this Shino boy's father. His little friends always warned them of approaching enemies, giving them plenty of time to change position. The Inuzuka boy undoubtedly had a good nose like most of his family, as would his dog. He was a little loud, and a bit of a braggart though. There was also a Hyuga there, and Kurane recognized the girl, Hinata, that she'd escorted to the academy years ago. She'd done a tour at the academy while recovering from her wounds and preparing for the Jonin exam. She'd been dispatched to the Hyuga compound in response to a request from the clan head, Hyuga Hayashi. The man coldly informed her that his daughter was hopelessly weak and unable to master more than the basics of the Hyuga gentle fist taijutsu style. It was hoped that she'd be of some use to the village as a shinobi if she was too weak to serve the family directly. The fact that he told her this in front of the silent girl sorely tested Kurane's patience. Of course, she expected no less from the leader of the white-eyed bastards. Aside from that silent girl, she'd never seen a member of that prestigious family that wasn't stuck up and arrogant. Well, Matai wasn't like that, but it wasn't really the same. Remembering her old comrade always brought a pang, and she needed her concentration to focus on the quiet girl. As if in reaction against the rest of her family's arrogance, the Hyuga girl was still painfully shy and timid. She sat by herself and kept her head down so much it took Kurane a while to confirm she actually had the Byakugan eyes her family was famed for. The only time the girl seemed to perk up at all was when the class troublemaker came tearing past, being chased by the Yamanaka girl and some pink-haired kunoichi in training that had to be a Harino. Kurane was a genin fresh out of the academy when the Kyuubi attacked Konoha. She and most of her friends were assigned to areas of the battlefield far from the worst of the fighting, which was probably the only reason any of them had survived that night. She didn't have any personal animosity against the child the fourth had sealed the demon fox into. It wasn't like the little Gaki had asked for it. Still, this Uzumaki Naruto seemed to be quite a handful. He was always pulling pranks, though never anything really mean or hurtful. Mostly he just seemed a little starved for attention. Unfortunately, that was something most of the academy instructors seemed unwilling to give him. To his credit, Umino Irika seemed to be the least prejudiced of the lot. His irritation seemed to be focused more on the boy's poor study habits and hell-raising. At least his antics were occasionally entertaining. He did show a lot of creativity in his mischief, and the reactions of those around him also gave Kurane some insight into their personalities. Unfortunately, it looked like his lack of focus had caught up with him that afternoon, during the genin exam. A fair number of his classmates ran out of the building afterward, proudly displaying their new hitai, but the blonde-haired boy just trudged over to the swings and sat there, the picture of dejection. Kurane was surprised to note that someone else was watching the boy as well. The Hyuga girl stared at him from behind a post. She was obviously distraught, blushing and pushing her forefingers together in a nervous gesture. At the same time, the girl stood up straighter than Kurane had ever seen her. She fidgeted behind the post, stepping out from behind it only to step back again without doing anything. From what Kurane could see, the girl's cheeks were bright red. The Jonin smiled to herself as she slipped away. With no curse seal, the girl was obviously of the Hyuga main family. For such a one to be attracted to a ruffian like the one who bore the Kuwabai was an ineradicable smear on her family's honor. Good for her. The thought cheered Kurane as she made her way to the Hokage Tower. The Sandaime and the new Jonin sensei would be meeting with the academy instructors to go over the test results and decide how to split the new Genins into effective teams. It was nearly nightfall by the time all the Jonins arrived, mostly due to Heitake Kakashi's chronic tardiness. She understood the reasons for his frequent diversions all too well, but that was not a good reason to make everyone wait for over an hour. Although she supposed the same could be said of her violent dislike of the Hyuga clan. The first bit of bad news was that only 8 students had passed the Genin test. That meant one team would be short a student, or they would be forming 2 4-person teams. Kurane wondered if she'd be let off the hook, but Sarutobi soon scuttled that hope. He said he didn't think the best of Jonins could give 4 students sufficient attention for their development. The Jonins sometimes whispered on drinking nights that the old man still blamed himself for Orochimaru's betrayal of Konoha. No sane person blamed the old man for his grown students' actions, but Kurane knew quite well that guilt follows no logic but its own. No sooner had they settled that question and began wrangling over who would only have 2 Genins than a messenger arrived. It seemed that someone had broken into the Sandaime's quarters and made off with a scroll of forbidden jutsus. No one was sure who had done it, but Uzumaki Naruto had been seen in the vicinity just before the break-in was noticed. Umino Irika went pale as a ghost when he heard this news, confirming to Kurane's eye that the man did care something about the unwanted child. He immediately rushed out to join the search for the boy. How did Naruto do in the examination? The Sandaime asked one of the academy record keepers. He did not pass, Hokage-sama, the man asked without even checking his scroll. If he was able to break into the Hokage's office and make off with a heavily guarded scroll, it makes me wonder how hard that test is, Asuma grumbled sourly. He'd been forbidden to smoke inside and Kurane was sure he was suffering from lack of nicotine. Sarutobi seemed unusually unconcerned about the missing scroll, so after he went up to his office they instead sat around discussing the strengths and weaknesses of the Genins as they looked through the reports. It seemed a little odd to do this when neither of the senior instructors were present. Kakashi volunteered to oversee the training of the Uchiha survivor, which made sense given his use of a Sharingan-ai. He also was willing to only have 2 students. This was presumably so he could devote more time to Uchiha Sasuke, but Kurane wondered how much of that was just laziness. It seemed to her that the more skilled the ninja, the more eccentric their personal habits became. It also made her wonder if her own ambitions to improve her skills would become ultimately self-destructive. The copycat ninja was feared throughout the ninja world, but he was also squirrely as hell with his chronic tardiness and perverted reading material. In fact, his fingers were reaching for the corner of a brightly colored book protruding from his flak vest when Sarutobi led Irika back into the room, the latter missing his hitai. "It looks like we have a 9th graduate," the Chiryunin gasped after sitting down. He looked like he'd been in a nasty brawl, he was covered with cuts and scrapes, including a really large gouge in the middle of his back. What happened, Irika? Maybe it was Kurene's imagination, but the slight smile the Hokage wore indicated he knew more than he let on. It was Mizuki that betrayed us, Hokage-sama. When Naruto couldn't produce a good bunshin, he failed the jutsu portion of the exam. Mizuki told him that stealing the scroll and bringing it to him would count as extra credit and allow him to still pass the exam. He fell for that. Kakashi asked in surprise. And we're considering making him a ninja. Why? If students cannot trust their sensei, who can they trust? Irika asked stiffly. We cannot punish him for listening to a teacher, can we? He turned toward the Hokage with the last question. The Sandaime nodded gravely. I agree. If we cannot guarantee the loyalty of the people who teach our children, we cannot blame them for doing no better than we. He looked at Irika for a second. What happened to your forehead protector? Umino. Irika smiled proudly. I gave it to Naruto for passing the exam. He'd failed to produce a simple bunshin, but when he was defending me from Mizuki's attacks he revealed that he'd learned Kage Bunshin no Jutsu and filled that whole section of the forest with clones. I literally lost count. But Kage Bunshin is much harder to perform. Asuma protested. Irika shrugged happily. That's why I passed him. He's quite surprising. Well then, it looks like we have 3 full-size teams now, Sarutobi said with a faint smile. Most of the Jonins knew he sympathized with the boy's lack of family. Kakashi, if you will take Naruto, that will dash. Your pardon, Hokage-sama, Kurane broke in. She'd been thinking about the Hyuga girl. With her bloodline, she had tremendous potential, but her confidence issues were worrisome. Now she saw a possible way around them. I wouldn't mind having Naruto on my team. Are you sure of that? Sarutobi asked. She also saw Asuma and some of the academy workers quietly shaking their heads. I understand your team is to specialize in reconnaissance missions, and Naruto doesn't show a lot of potential in that area. Or any other. She thought she saw one of the record keepers mouth to his co-worker. Irika shifted painfully in his seat to glare at them. After what happened to my genin team, she said coolly, I'd prefer that my new team not be overly specialized. If they fall into a trap, she continued, giving the last word a slightly sarcastic emphasis that made the Sandaime wince, it would do well to have someone with the ability to get us out of a perilous situation. A genin capable of filling the woods with Kage Bunshin would be able to provide quite a distraction, wouldn't he? Besides, I also seem to remember a large number of Chiryunins, Jonins, and Umbu pursuing that boy after he decorated the Hokage monument. He led you on quite a chase, didn't he? Several faces in the room looked a bit sheepish after that. Irika, on the other hand, appeared happy that someone was recognizing his pupil's abilities. Of course, he was also the one who eventually caught the boy. She turned toward Kakashi. Kiba is passable with his taijutsu, but he also spends a lot of time working with Akamaru. They work well together and might give your students an example of the teamwork you seem to prize. Psychologically, the Inuzuka boy is like most of his family and very group-oriented. He's a little boisterous, but friendly enough he might be able to thaw out that Uchiha head case. Kurane noticed that everyone in the room was staring at her. She sighed. When I was selected to mentor a genin team, I decided to spend a few days observing them interact and getting a handle on their personalities. Am I the only Jonin in this room that bothers to think ahead? Kakashi was reading his book and Asuma was fiddling with his cigarette. Evidently, she was. She sighed and laid her face in her hands. Fine, then. Just take my word for it. The Uchiha kid is a self-centered brat and you're going to have your work cut out for you. Sarutobi grunted. I would think Naruto would be able to warm him up a bit better. And it is traditional that the highest and lowest ranked genins be placed on the same team to balance it out. Perhaps, Kurane agreed. But I think that kid's been through enough without sticking him on a team with 2 people who won't appreciate him, and neither Harino nor Uchiha respect him at all. Besides, given what he did tonight, I'm not sure I agree with his assessment results. The third Hokage nodded thoughtfully. You think he will do better on your team? Abarame Shino seems neutral toward the boy, which is better than the outright disparagement he receives from other students. Hyuga Hinata would be his friend if she were not so shy. Kurane paused for a moment before continuing. I believe that if your law mandating secrecy regarding the Jin hierarchy were to be strictly enforced, all of the academy students would be made orphans. Yuhai Kurane was quite sure that, were she to drop a senbon, the clatter when it struck the floor would have been deafening in that silence. That is ridiculous. One of the academy workers snapped. I have never heard one whisper of the Kyuubi in all the time I have worked here. No parent has told their child of it. No, Kurane drawled, they instead tell their children to hate Uzumaki Naruto and shun him for no reason they will admit. You don't hide a secret by drawing attention to it with bright lights and dancing around it, doing everything you can get away with that doesn't involve saying the forbidden words. Sarutobi sighed and sagged in his chair for a moment. Kurane was reminded how old he actually was, and how he'd been enjoying his retirement up until his successor was forced to sacrifice his life to seal the Kyuubi. She felt a stab of shame that she'd reminded him of how little some of the villagers deserved his protection. Anyway, she continued in a kinder voice, I think the Gaki has a lot of potential. If I can bring it out, he may one day become a formidable shinobi. That may be a lot of work, Irika said in a cautious voice. Kurane's eye caught him wincing a little, obviously torn by his loyalty to the boy. She considered that a point in his favor. It will be worth it to prevent any more accidents, she said in little more than a whisper. Even Kakashi managed to look uncomfortable, for all that his mask hid. Very well, the Hokage said in a quiet voice. I will want weekly reports on the boy's progress and his physical and mental state. Kurane nodded. She expected as much. Hyuga Hinata had not slept well that night. Yesterday had been the last day she'd likely see Naruto in a long time. She passed her genin exam, but he would be staying at the academy for remedial classes until he could pass. He tried so hard that it broke her heart to see him fail. For once, his smiling mask had slipped and he'd walked outside like a broken-down old man. And still she failed to say anything to the boy who inspired her so much with his attitude and ever-present smile. Her father was right, she was a useless coward. Not brave enough to do more than hide and watch him like some pathetic stalker. She'd always been a little embarrassed for the sillier kunoichis who chased Uchiha Sasuke around like a miniature fan club. But in the end, was she any better? She was just as harebrained and silly, and even more cowardly. Those girls at least had the courage to let Sasuke know that they liked him. Not even the prospect of not seeing Naruto anymore could make her act, and she despised herself for it. She'd been too upset at herself to even think of eating breakfast, and her steps faltered as she slowly walked to the Konoha Ninja Academy for the last time. Her only consolation was the possibility that she might see Naruto there again today. It was fairly common for students who failed the genin exam to stay home the following day. It was painful and embarrassing to see your classmates who were leaving to become full-fledged shinobi, even if they were only reporting to a different room for team assignments. But then again, Naruto seldom did the usual thing. The prospect of seeing him again, even if it would be the last time in a long while, buoyed her spirit. Maybe today she would find the courage to actually speak to him. Her steps quickened as hope slowly leaked into her heart. She soon made her way into the academy building and found the classroom where the new genins were assembled. Her classmates were spread out in their usual disarray, but Naruto was there as well, with his head down on a desk. She froze in shock as she walked in the door, but then her feet automatically led her to one of her usual seats, high up and near the door in the back, everyone ahead of her and no one behind. She stared at the boy, wondering if someone would come in and tell him to leave. Finally, Narashikamaru ambled into the room and stopped by Naruto's table. When he asked Naruto why he was there, the blonde boy sat up and said he'd passed, showing off his new hitaiite. Naruto congratulated too, she whispered to herself. Then Ino and Sakura burst into the room, arguing about who arrived first. Naruto stared in her direction, his face lighting up, and Hinata felt her heart skip a beat. But then the pink-haired kunoichi walked by her and she realized Naruto was looking at her instead. Ohio, Sakura-chan. Naruto greeted her with a smile as she approached. Out of my way. Sakura snarled as she elbowed him to the floor so she could sit next to Uchiha Sasuke. An unpleasant voice in Hinata's head said it was glad that the girl Naruto seemed to like did not return his affections. But for the most part, she was dismayed to see him treated so cavalierly. Then Ino contested Sakura's right to sit in the chair she'd just thrown poor Naruto out of. In moments, most of the girls in the room were arguing over the evicted seat while Naruto was still sprawled at their feet. Naruto climbed up on the desk and glared at Sasuke, again attracting the ire of Sasuke's fan club. Even worse, an inattentive boy at the table in front of them bumped into Naruto, making his and Sasuke's faces meet. It was hard to tell from where she sat, but from the screams of outrage that followed immediately afterward, it seems the two boys had inadvertently kissed. Hinata thought it was somewhat funny, especially the way the two boys carried on afterwards, spitting and gagging like they'd been poisoned. The Sasuke fan club trademark, on the other hand, was incensed at Naruto's forward behavior, not to mention quite jealous. The beating they gave Naruto was well out of proportion to his actual offense. Hinata grew worried as they showed no signs of stopping. She pushed back her chair and was about to intervene when Iruka-sensei entered the room and broke it up. Poor Naruto looked like he'd been run over by a farmer's wagon. When Iruka-sensei announced that the teams had been chosen, Hinata began pressing her index fingers together as her thoughts raced. I might be on a team with Naruto-kun. I might not be on a team with Naruto-kun. Those two thoughts kept repeating as the instructor worked his way down the list. Team 7, Inuzuka Kiba, Harano Sakura, and Uchiha Sasuke. Sakura looked ecstatic as Ino's face fell. Naruto also seemed horribly disappointed, and Hinata couldn't help but feel sorry for him, even though her own hopes were rising. Team 8, Hyuga Hinata, Uzumaki Naruto, and Abarame Shino. Naruto's expression didn't change, but Hinata thought her heart would explode out of her chest. She knew her racing pulse was making her cheeks flush, but she couldn't help it. Not only had Naruto passed, but they would be together on the same team. This was rapidly becoming one of the happiest days of her life, definitely the happiest since her mother died. When the team assignments were completed, they were given a long lunch break, as their Jonin instructors would be meeting with them that afternoon. Sasuke immediately got up and stalked out of the room, Sakura trailing behind him. Kiba grunted as he stood up, frowning at already being left behind by his team. Naruto stared after Sakura, and sat in silence after she left. Hinata felt ashamed that she'd been happy he was on her team instead of Sakura's. She was an awful person if she took joy from the sadness of someone she admired. She looked down at her hands and began pressing her fingers again. She was too ashamed to look up as Naruto left the room. After a while she got up and went outside. She saw Abarame Shino sitting on a bench near the playground. Determined to get to know her other teammate, Hinata sat down on the other end of the bench from the silent boy. "Ano. I understand we are to be teammates," she said in a quiet voice. The Abarame genius turned toward her, his face expressionless, what little of it she could see behind the high collar and the dark glasses he wore. "Hi," he said in little more than a whisper. He then turned back and Hinata realized he was studying an anthill that had been constructed in front of the bench. Hinata blinked and began unpacking her lunch. She thought of offering some to her teammate. She tended to bring more than she needed, on the off chance that one day Naruto would forget to bring his usual cup ramen. Alas, she never had the chance to share her food with him, not that she would have had the courage to approach him, she reproached herself bitterly. Shino, however, had also brought food. It was a little disconcerting to see his Kikai bugs swarming onto the dish as they consumed a portion of his rice and fish. They confined themselves to one corner of the square container as Shino's chopsticks fed their host. Hinata bit into a rice ball and wondered what she could do. She'd never been in this position before, trying to converse with someone who was even quieter than she was. "Ano, which Jonin do you think we will be assigned to?" Shino turned toward her again. He seemed to stare at her for a long moment, making her fingers fidget even faster. "Given our abilities, I would think one of the scouting specialists. Uzumaki's presence is troubling though." Hinata took a deep breath. "I'm sure he will work very hard to make us successful," she said in as firm a voice as she could muster. Shino simply regarded her for several heartbeats before answering. "Perhaps. But he doesn't possess a bloodline or sensory abilities. I question what role he could perform, or if he was simply placed here to keep him out of the way." Hinata felt her stomach contract into a small, hard ball. She always questioned whether she would actually be useful as a ninja or not. Was Team 8 just a place for throwaway ninjas? Had she and Naruto been placed here to keep them out of the way? But what about Shino? He was supposed to be the pride of the Abarame clan, the best bug user they'd produced in over a generation. "Ano. I don't think we're a team for shinobi that no one wants. Naruto works very hard when he trains by himself, and he still received a Hittite." Shino turned back toward his lunch. "That may have been done to remove him from the academy. There is something about him that the adults do not like. My clan will not speak of it, but they do not hold him in high regard. While Hinata was glad that Shino was speaking more, his words disturbed her. She remembered the way her father's face twisted when one of Naruto's pranks was mentioned at dinner. The branch family retainer blanched under Otosan's furious glare, and for an instant Hinata thought his cursed seal had been activated. Hinata may not have been the ideal Hyuga warrior, but even without her Byakugan active, she was still intelligent and above all, observant. As such, the looks some of the adults gave the object of her affections did not escape her notice. Surely they don't hate him for pulling a few pranks. Naruto-kun never hurt anyone, not even by accident. I believe it's something deeper than that. I've heard his name mentioned in passing even before the first time he defaced the Hokage monument, Shino replied. Hinata was too involved in their conversation to wonder at how her teammate seemed to have finally discovered that he had a voice. Later, she would wonder if it was the teasing a part of a mystery that finally engaged him, or if it was simply the fact that someone was actively seeking to speak with him. Hinata wasn't especially fond of insects, but they didn't creep her out like they did some girls. What else could he have done to become so unpopular, she asked, frowning. It may not be anything he did, Shino replied. I don't know of another Uzumaki in the village, so he may have come from a family that disgraced themselves in some fashion. Hokage-sama wouldn't execute a child for the crimes of the parents, no matter how heinous. The villagers may not be so forgiving. Hinata sat there, her mind racing as a half-eaten rice ball fell back into her bento. As far as she knew, Naruto-kun had no parents, and was forced to live alone as there was no one who would take him in. To think that he would still be blamed for the actions of people he'd never met made her feel very strangely. It was similar to the tight feeling she got when Otosan told her Hanabi would make a better heir and how she at least could make him proud, but the emotion gripping her right now was much stronger. Hyuga Hinata was angry. These people deliberately hurt her Naruto-kun with their cold eyes. The boy with the big dreams who always smiled and tried again no matter what, he deserved better than that. She'd seen his smile slip a few times, the most recently after the genin exam, and even if she was too cowardly to say anything to him, his sorrow still stabbed her heart like a kunai. After a moment she was able to master her new emotions and don the sterile mask she was taught a Hyuga must always present to others. That is very foolish of them, she said coldly, since he is going to be Hokage someday. Shino didn't say anything, but turned back to his lunch. While he didn't necessarily sound like he agreed with her, Hinata would settle for a lack of overt disagreement. They finished their meal in silence and returned to the academy to await their sensei. Naruto sat at his desk with his head in his hands. The ache in his stomach was finally subsiding, but the pain in his heart was worse. It wasn't fair that Sakura was assigned to a different team, and even worse that she was partnered up with that Uchiha team. When he saw Sasuke eating his lunch, Naruto was struck by inspiration. This might be his last chance to find out what Sakura really thought of him. Fortunately, the overconfident jerk was surprisingly easy to subdue. So much for genius. The look on his face when the Kawarimi log appeared in a cloud of smoke and half a dozen clones descended on him like the wrath of Kami was the high point of Naruto's day. After that it was simply a matter of tying the fool up and using Henge no Jutsu to copy his appearance. He found Sakura where he'd left her, scorning his presence and mooning after Sasuke team. He didn't think she could really be that cruel, not W. Thanks for listening, I hope you enjoyed it. If you want the next part to this video please turn on that bell notification and please like and subscribe. If you have a fanfiction you want done or you have an idea for a what if, please comment it down below. Till next video.